Okay, so if you look down inside the block, okay, where the bearings go, okay, this one here is called the thrust bearing. Different engines put it in different places. This one happens to go in the middle. Now the thing to remember with the thrust bearing is this. When this goes in, when you step on the gas, your car accelerates, okay? In physics, we call it the right-hand rule. There's a force, it's that way. There's a rotation that says this way. There's going to be a torque, and the actual crankshaft is going to move back and forth in the engine. So when you step on it, it's going to go one way, and when you decelerate, it's going to go the other way. Also, if this were a manual, when you push on it with the clutch back here, it's going to tend to force the crankshaft in and back and forth. That's why this thing has wear on either side of it. It's called the thrust bearing. But again, any engine, when you step on the gas, and you accelerate the engine or you slow the engine down, any engine, the crankshaft's going to go back and forward. You need this wear piece on there. And again, different engines have that in a different place. So they're not always in the same location. So this one happens to be in the middle. Also, note, these are what are called oil passages, and you can see down in there, you can see kind of embossed in it. The oil comes through those passages up into here and oils each of these main bearings, we call them. Okay. Now, this engine is upside down currently. Okay. So when I think about this, I always think, oh, that's the bottom piece of the bearing. The top piece will not have a hole in it. Okay, and that's this. And so they won't always have a hole in the top piece. Now, again, if you look at the other main bearings over here, this is not the thrust bearing. See that guy? Doesn't have one, whereas that piece does. The middle one, on this particular engine, the middle one does actually pass all the way through. Now, that's not true on all. It'd be different. But again, when you do this, again, what's called the top bearing, because this is upside down. It'll look like the bottom when it's laying like this. When it's upside down, it'll be on the top, like so. We'll have the holes in it because that's how you oil these bearings and lube them up as we go along. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put them in. What you'll notice is that there's a spot right here, this little piece that sticks out right there, goes into this little spot right, get your finger out of the way, dummy, right there. And that's how they will line up. Never ever touch the bearings with your hands. There's a grease on your hands that'll tend to hurt the surfaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push this in there, here and here, and here. And I may have to put this phone down to finish the job. It should sit down nice and flush when I'm all done. Okay? I'm not going to force it or anything, but it's going to sit in there nice and flush when I'm finished with it. I'm going to get all 5 of the main bearings in. Okay? When we get all 5 of them in, we're going to set the crankshaft down on top of it. Then we're going to put the top of the main bearing caps on. You'll see me do that. And we're going to check for clearances. Remember, clearance is the idea of what goes inside has to be smaller than what's on the outside. Now, we're talking somewhere probably between 1 and 3 thousandths of clearance is what we should end up with. If you had like 5 or 10 inches, yeah, that'd be a good one, Jay. If you had like 5 or 10 thousandths, boy, that'd be really, really worn out and sloppy. We wouldn't want that. So we'll be checking for that. So we'll come back to you. Okay, so here you can see I've got all 5 main bearings in. Why don't you focus, you hippie? No, I don't know. Whatever. There they are. They're all 5 in. You notice that this is the rear seal. This is the rear bearing. It's bigger than the rest. It has a bigger cap on it. The oil pump bolts on here as well. And then here you're going to have what's called the rear main seal sits back in there. That's to keep the oil from running out of the back of the engine. Okay. Right now I'm going to go over and I'm going to clean the crankshaft up. It needs to be cleaned up a little bit. Wipe her down good. Clean it off. And then I'm going to set it in there. Then we're going to measure. I'm going to show you how we measure clearance. Okay, so a fancy guy, somebody who is really good with the micrometer, would do it this way. So you notice I don't have this torque down yet. There's still a gap here. But what you do is you torque these bolts down to what they're supposed to be torqued to. This would close that gap up. Then we'd use our inside hole gauges, the telescoping hole gauges, to measure this. Then they go over and measure on the crank, the actual journal of the crank, and they'd subtract them to find the clearance. Now, the average person, and that includes me, who does this once in a while, here at the shop, I have the equipment to do inside mics and outside mics. At home, I have a mic, I have a caliper, I don't have any hole gauges. I couldn't do this well. And so what I'm going to show you is what I would do, what most people do who do this for fun, not for necessarily because we're building race engines. And so I'm going to show you the other way to measure these clearances. All right, I'm back. So over here you can see down there on the crank, see that green right here? Come on, where's my finger? I can't find my finger. There it is. See that little green trace right there? And you can see it here a little bit better. This is the one with the thrust bearing, so it was mushed and then it wasn't mushed. This one up here, very little mushing. Where is it? Very little mushing on this guy. And so that's going to say that we have a very big clearance here on this one. So what I'm going to do is take you to the actual rod caps, the main bearing caps themselves. And we're going to look at the caps themselves because it's easier to visualize it on the caps itself. So here is number one upside down, and down in the bottom of that, maybe you can. God dang it, there's too much light in here. Whoever heard of such a thing? There's too much light. God dang it. All right, I will do one that's not. I will do one that's a little more obvious. Okay. I think it was this one here. Yes, this one here. Nice. So if you look at this green trace down the bottom of it, you see how smooshed out it is. The trick is to see which of these sizes here it lines up with. So you're going to line it up there, and you're like, well, no, it's not that fat. Well, let's line up with this white mark. Is it as fat as the white mark? Well, I feel like it's not quite as fat as that white mark. What about this green? Oh, it's somewhere between the green mark and the white mark. You see that? So it's somewhere between 1.5 and 2 thousandths of an inch of clearance. We're like, well, Mr. Groom, what is the clearance supposed to be for this engine on its main bearings? Turns out it's between 1 and 3 thousandths. That's pretty common on engines like this. It's pretty common, 1 to 3 thousandths. And so we look pretty good there. Now this one here, it looks like it's right in the neighborhood of between 3 and 2 thousandths. So we're good. Let's check out number 4. Now this one rolled around the corner with me for some reason. I'm not really sure why, but it did. Not unheard of. So again, this one's somewhere between 1.5 and 2 thousandths. We're golden. And the big one in the back, you're like, wait, that one didn't smush very much at all, Mr. Groom. No, you're right, it didn't. So what does that mean? It means it's got a bigger clearance. A bigger clearance. So somewhere in the ballpark of, 3 thousandths-ish, maybe 2.5, somewhere in that ballpark. And that's what, I'm going to go back over here to the crank in the actual engine and look at number 1. And so if you look at this number 1 right here, if you match it up, yeah, it's about 3. Actually, it might be a skosh bigger than 3. Again, if this were my daily driver, I might be concerned about that. But if this were my daily driver, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I would probably instead take the crank down, get it turned 10 thousandths under on both the main journal. What are you doing? I'm trying to turn around so you can see my ugly mug. What's the deal here? Anyways, well, whatever. Anywho, you take it down and you turn the crank journals and the rod journals down 10 thousandths of an inch here and here. Okay, all of them. And then what you do is you go and get yourself bigger bearings so that they are bigger bearings because the journal got smaller, and then you could then dial in a better clearance. Okay, but again, I'm not doing this to put in my daily driver. I'm doing this to show you how this engine bit works. I'm not trying to spend a ton of money doing it.
That's all, folks.